Today, I'm diving into Frank Stone, a new game from Supermassive Games, the team behind Until Dawn, The Quarry, and the Dark Picture series. Like their previous titles, Frank Stone is a narrative-driven adventure game with branching paths. However, what stands out is its setting within the Dead by Daylight universe. You might expect this to make the game more streamlined, perhaps aiming to replicate the chaos of its source material. Unfortunately, that's not the case. In fact, this might be the slowest-paced game from Supermassive yet. Initially, that sense of calm felt intriguing, but it just dragged on. The pacing is sluggish, and even as you near the end, it still feels like nothing substantial has happened. The game's 4-hour runtime spends much of its time going in circles, which makes the experience feel frustratingly stagnant. I'll be blunt. This is a horror game where most of the action is confined to the first and last 20 minutes. The rest of the game? Mostly filler. You're left spinning your wheels, waiting for something to happen, only for nothing to change. Supermassive might call it world building or character development, but there's just too much backtracking and very little of it feels purposeful. The first half of the game does show promise, but by the second hour, it starts to drag, and you'll find yourself wishing for the killer to make an appearance. Even when that happens, it's underwhelming. Overall, it's disappointing because there's a strong foundation here. The story is divided into 3 segments. A prologue in the 1960s where a young cop hunts a serial killer in an old steel mill. A framing story in 2024 where 3 strangers gather in a creepy mansion. And the main narrative set in 1980, following teenagers trying to make a movie. At first, it feels like a solid setup. You've got a haunted movie, a serial killer's ghost, a mysterious witch, and a spooky mansion packed with puzzles. Classic horror elements. But it's all built up with no real payoff. By the time the horror kicks in, you're almost at the end. Visually, the game does look impressive. The human character animations are a step up from the Dark Pictures games, and while they sometimes push the limits of performance capture, it generally looks great. The environments, especially in the first half, are atmospheric and varied. Early on, it seemed like the entire game would take place in the abandoned steel mill, but the 2024 and 1980 segments add some welcome diversity. Sadly, by the latter half, you're back to running around the same areas, and it quickly becomes monotonous. One thing I'll give credit for is the attempt to make the cast more likable. Typically, these games include characters designed to die in gruesome ways. And while there's at least one of those in this game, looking at you, Top Knot Guy from 2024, most of the cast is clearly meant to be sympathetic. There's a lot more character development here compared to Supermassive's other titles. However, not all the characters land. Some of the jokes are painfully awkward, but they're at least trying. In the end, if the build-up had led to a satisfying conclusion, this could have been one of Supermassive's better horror stories. Unfortunately, it just doesn't come together. The game essentially comes to a halt at a certain point, with everyone stuck in a kind of purgatory, wandering the same hallways for an hour. If you play this, you're going to get tired of seeing the same furnace room. You end up going back and forth through it 6 or 7 times. For the most part, it doesn't even try to be scary. Despite the title character, Frank Stone, being the focus, he leaves very little impression. This is supposed to be an origin story for him, but the game gets bogged down in unnecessary details. To be fair, Dead by Daylight has some strange lore worth exploring, but maybe not to this extent in a game centered on Frank Stone. He feels like a footnote by the end, which is odd considering he's in the title. There are fun Easter eggs for Dead by Daylight fans, but what starts as cute references eventually becomes overkill. For example, the first time you repair a generator, it's a neat nod, but by the 3rd time, it just feels tired. The game spends so much time tossing in lore and Easter eggs that it forgets about its own story. Instead of standing on its own, it ends up as a collection of references. If I wanted that, I'd watch Deadpool or Wolverine. It's frustrating because I was ready to engage with the story, but once the slasher multiverse was introduced, I was already checking out. I understand it ties into Dead by Daylight lore, but did they need to follow it so closely? The game should have focused more on telling its own story. It's like if the Arcane show was just setting up why everyone's fighting in lanes in League of Legends. You don't need to interpret everything so literally. Give us something scary with a Dead by Daylight flavor, and that's enough. The game should offer a taste of the universe to draw people in, not overwhelm them with references. Supermassive's other games are similar to Telltale's style: dialogue choices, exploration, quick-time events. This game tries something different by incorporating long stretches of exploration and simple puzzles. In these moments, it feels less like Telltale and more like The Last of Us, but only during the downtime. There's a lot of walking, crawling through narrow gaps, and solving unremarkable puzzles. In most games, this would be the connective tissue between action, but here it just feels like filler. Yes, having breaks in the action can help balance a game, but here it's all downtime. You make choices, but they rarely seem to matter. Early on, you choose whether to climb a fence to enter the steel mill, but the result is just slightly different scenery for a minute. No major events change. It's not a meaningful choice. It's more of an and instead of a but or a therefore, which is the foundation of good storytelling. Without those key story shifts, the experience feels flat. Choices need real consequences. Yes, there are some in this game. Characters can die, but most only have the chance to meet their end in the last half hour. You could lose someone earlier, but it's usually in clear fail states, making the deaths unsatisfying, especially for a horror game. Almost all the kills here feel underwhelming, with multiple characters impaled on spikes like in Dead by Daylight. It's tame for a slasher, and some deaths feel almost accidental, which is a big problem for a game that should be scary. That's the biggest flaw. It's not frightening. People buy horror games expecting at least some level of fear, but this game doesn't deliver. And if that's not the point, it's also not intriguing. It tries to be, but it just ends up being dull. For a 4-hour story with a $40 price tag, it should either be filled with non-stop carnage, or at least keep things interesting. They could have incorporated more killers, or added some unique twists from the Dead by Daylight universe. If they had gone that route instead of diving into a multiverse, it might have justified the lore better. Frank Stone could have been a cool character, but he barely matters here. Beyond Frank, the game is mostly just wandering around a steel mill. I appreciate Supermassive's attempt to add more gameplay elements to their formula, but it's not enough. There's a basic action mechanic where you point a camera at a ghost to make it disappear, something we've seen before, and not particularly exciting. With that said, I didn't actively dislike the game. It starts off intriguing with a strong, simple horror premise, but it just doesn't deliver in a satisfying way by the end. It's not a total disaster like Little Hope, which had a laughable ending, but it's nowhere near the quality of Until Dawn. In Until Dawn, the pacing was tight, the choices mattered, and character deaths weren't automatic fail states. Here, there's none of that. I always root for Supermassive, even when they miss the mark. I want to enjoy their games, and I love the idea of a horror adventure. It's a shame their budget doesn't allow for something on the scale of Until Dawn anymore, because a fully fleshed out Dead by Daylight narrative game could be great. But this isn't it. It's too light on content, too padded. I can't recommend it for $40. If this were a $10 game, its flaws would be more forgivable, but at $40, it's not worth it. If you're curious, wait for a deep discount or for it to hit Game Pass. It's just not worth the price. Even fans of Supermassive, like myself, won't find enough value here for that kind of money. If you're not into their style or unfamiliar with them, there's nothing in this game that will change your mind. I'd recommend it only to die-hard fans, and only if they wait for a sale. That's all I have to say. What do you think? Leave a comment and let us know. If you like this video, hit the like button, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We upload new content every day, so click subscribe, and don't forget to turn on notifications. As always, thanks so much for watching.